The topic of our next lesson has made Photoshop experts coast to coast quake in their collective boots, bang their heads against their collective walls, and generally speaking, wish they'd never learned how to use Photoshop because it's very frustrating. It's very difficult. There are people out there whom, if you ask them how to do this on message boards, they will tell you it's impossible. Now, I'm going to show you that it's not impossible, but by the end of this lesson, you may not agree with me because there's any number of places this could go wrong. If you don't follow the steps exactly, you may not get exactly the same results. Don't blame yourself. Feel free to blame me if you like. But basically what we're going to delve into here are features that, let's just say it, they're not terribly well implemented in Photoshop, and you need to really understand how they work and jump through a few hoops in order to get them to work. And what we're talking about, we're dancing around this, but what we're talking about basically is linking objects together into a single object, and especially importing objects and linking them to objects that you've created inside of Photoshop so that you can actually work with everything as if it's a single object. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, because every layer in Photoshop believes that it is in its own space. It has its own set of lights. It has its own camera. It has its own camera coordinates, its own perspective. And all of those things mean that in order to work with tons of different 3D layers and try to build a scene out of them, you're going to have to repeat lighting setups and camera setups several times over in order to get things to look like they live in the same space. It could be very tedious. But if you can get them all to be on the same 3D layer, you'll still have access to the individual objects via the 3D palette, but one set of lights, one camera, things can cast shadows on each other, and you get all these advantages out of building a 3D scene. This seems like a very intuitive thing that you would want to do, especially if you come from other 3D applications. But Photoshop does not make it easy on you, and certainly doesn't make it intuitive. In all likelihood, if you've been following along with me and you select the two layers in our chalice scene here, you will not find a way on your own to link these together. Right-clicking doesn't give you anything. Converting to a smart object is not what we want to do with this. That will merely combine these two into a single pixel layer. We don't want pixels, we want 3D geometry. Similarly, merging down would accomplish the same thing. If we attempted to merge the layers, they would simply turn into pixels. Again, that's not what we want to do. We want to keep our 3D geometry. If we pop up here into the 3D menu, we might be tantalized if we look through the grayed out selections by this little command here, merge 3D layers. Now, depending on everything that you've done so far and whether you've fiddled with things on your own, you may be able to select this feature, but in all likelihood, you won't. Most of the time, you can't, and most of the time, people who try to find how to enable this on their own do not succeed. And the reason is, in order to merge 3D layers, Photoshop first wants you to put those 3D elements into a state that resembles its own scene. And by that I mean a state where they share the same camera angles, the same lighting scenarios, etc. Well, a second ago we just said you couldn't do that. Well, in fact, you kind of can. And the way to do that is to come over to our camera controls and note when we have a layer selected, for example, base, that there's a pop-up here, a view pop-up that says default in our case, but also gives you a bunch of other views that you can choose for this scene. Left, right, top, bottom, back, front. Lots of things that you may be familiar with if you're familiar with other 3D applications, although these unfortunately always end up centering themselves on the object on a per layer basis, which makes it difficult to line things up. And then there's this feature called the straight on camera, which you may or may not get. Sometimes you'll see it there, sometimes you won't. But down at the bottom, aha, this one's actually useful. Cup. This means if you select this, and wait just a moment for Photoshop to catch up, the base now shares the same camera data as the cup layer. Now, if you've done everything that I've done so far, exactly the way I've done it, you won't see any difference because we took great pains to make sure that we only moved these objects along one axis so that they would line up a little bit later. But assuming you've done that, and now that you've switched this camera control to cup, make sure that you're on the camera as well, not the geometry controls. If you're on the geometry controls and you choose this pop-up, you're actually going to move your layer to the position of these other layers. That can be useful, but it's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that our camera tool is selected and that you've chosen for the base the view of the cup layer. Now that we've done that, when you select both of these layers, you should be able to go up to the 3D menu. And look, we have made available to ourselves the ability to merge the 3D layers. And when we do, and Photoshop thinks about it for a few moments, this will vary depending on the speed of your computer, of course. We now have a single 3D layer. It's currently called base. Let's change this to chalice. And you'll notice that in the underlying textures, there are now 2 diffuse textures. There are now 2 depth maps. That's right. You can still go in and individually edit the depth map for each of these elements, even though we've now combined them into a single 3D layer. And if we check out our 3D palette, you'll see that in the context of our scene, we now have 2 meshes. You can even see the bounding box for the mesh down here at the bottom that comprise this scene. So we've effectively combined these 2 elements into a single scene, which means that now if we come over here to our little widget and start manipulating this scene, it in fact rotates the multiple elements as if they are a single element, which is exactly what we want. Let me undo that and get ourselves back to a neutral place. Now, as we start doing these sorts of things in Photoshop, we start hogging up a whole lot of memory. So I do recommend that you save periodically as we work our way through this lesson, because it is not outside the realm of possibility that we might do something too hard for Photoshop to handle and lock it up. So we do want to be able to recover from that. Now, if we pop out to Bridge again, we can remind ourselves that the center of our goblet is a skull with these crossed bones. These are femur bones. That's the big bone at the top of your leg, and the skull is just a skull. The proportions are a little funny. These won't match up with any off-the-shelf skull that you're going to find for sale out there on the internet. For one thing, it's got this sort of frowny face that we're not going to be able to duplicate. And in general, to model something this complex, it is beyond the scope of Photoshop. You would want to use a third-party sculpting application to do that. And I've done it for you. In order to be able to have something to work with, I exported a skull and some bones from Poser, brought them into Cinema 4D, and worked on them for about a day, smoothing things out and mushing things around and distorting things around until I got a skull and crossbones configuration that more or less resembled what we see here. I don't necessarily recommend that you take that approach as opposed to going to an excellent site like TurboSquid and buying a model for $10 and saving yourself all the work and possible failure and just getting exactly what you need. But meanwhile, we have this model already created, and now we're going to import it, and I'm going to show you the first major problem that we're going to run into.